Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. Have you ever wondered if moral principles can be the most powerful weapon in a galactic war? Today we will tell the story of humanity, which, despite all the ridicule and doubts, managed to change the course of the battle and prove that power is not only in technology. Stay with us to find out how they surprised even their most famous allies. The humans wanted to ally with us simply because we don't enslave people, Commander Donovan bellowed, his voice booming through the war room, rattling the walls. As if that alone is a good enough reason to choose a side in this conflict. They care about ideals, not survival. And the worst part? Their ships. He hammered his fist into the table, shaking the floor and making the lights above flicker. Their ships are pathetic. They designed them for one thing: railguns, lasers, missiles, speed, endurance. Each ship excels at one aspect but fails miserably at the others. What use is a fast ship that shatters from a single hit, or a railgun that's useless because it can't even aim properly? Talon sat across from him, his three eyes fixed on the commander. The vibrations of the commander's words irritated him, but he showed no outward sign of it. His long, delicate ears twitched as he listened to the grating voice. The room, dimly lit by bioluminescence, was meant to host multiple species, but it felt cramped and stuffy, with the Grimm's bulk dominating the space. The smell of the commander's fur was overpowering, thickening the air. Talon shifted slightly in his seat, his pink skin tight over his tall, spindly frame, standing in stark contrast to the Dax's dark, leathery hide. "Humans," Commander Donovan muttered, his tusks protruding in disgust. "They think they're morally superior just because they don't take slaves, but what does that matter? This war isn't about right and wrong, it's about power." Talon's central eye narrowed in irritation. "The humans believe they've chosen the path of justice," he said, a hint of disdain in his voice. He didn't care about the humans' reasons for joining. To him, their reasoning was as valid as any other species' justification for fighting. He just wanted the meeting to end quickly. "Their sense of justice doesn't interest me," he added flatly. "Why did they join? Who knows? But it's the same as any alliance made up of different species, each with their own motivations, many of which only make sense to their kind." The Vorn scoffed, his teeth bared in a jagged grin. "They think their principles will keep them safe? How naive. Those ships won't survive a day in real combat. When the Viz Union attacks, ideals won't protect them. Those ships will be nothing but cannon fodder." Talon could understand the frustration, but he found the anger misplaced. So what if the humans were ineffective? So what if their ships were overcomplicated and flawed? They didn't have anything to lose by accepting them as allies. He figured his species would simply laugh when the humans hit the battlefield, making a lot of noise and complaints, just like the Vorn. "I understand your concerns," Talon said calmly. "But I trust that the Grimm's expertise in combat will compensate for the shortcomings of the human ships." His words were shallow flattery, but it was enough to wrap up the discussion. Talon was eager to return to his people and mock the humans and the Grimm in peace, far away from the oppressive smell of the war room. The Grimm's growl softened, and his posture relaxed as he leaned back. "Our ships and warriors are the best in the galaxy," he boasted, flashing a grin that showed off his tusks. "We'll make up for the stupidity of their designs. Their ships may be weak, but our strength will win us this war." He paused and gave a small nod. "Thank you for your time, Talon." With that, the Vorn stomped out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. The silence that followed was a welcome relief. Talon stood and approached the control panel. With a quick flick of his long fingers, he activated the ventilation system. The soft hiss of the air valves cleared the stench of the Vorn from the room. Alone now, Talon's ears twitched in thought, imagining the mess that would unfold when the human ships finally arrived at the front lines. The idea was almost laughable. Days passed, and now Talon sat in the command ship, surrounded by his people's top warlords. The room was vast, the calming light from the ambient fixtures in the walls giving it a serene feel. The table they gathered around was sleek and curved, perfectly suited to the long limbs of the Kovac, allowing them to lounge comfortably. Some rested, their long fingers idly tracing patterns in the air, while others engaged in quiet conversation. Talon's three eyes scanned the room, feeling a deep sense of peace. This space was entirely Kovac. No loud Vorn voices, no foul pheromones, just the quiet presence of his people. It felt like a sanctuary, At the center of the table, a holographic display hovered, showing a glowing map of the battlefield. Small icons representing ships, both allies and enemies, moved in coordinated patterns, preparing for the inevitable clash. Talon's gaze lingered on the multi-species fleet, an unpredictable mix of technologies and strategies. Soon, the time for preparation would end, and the brutal reality of war would take over. No more rules, no more agreements, just raw, unforgiving conflict. Jackson, seated to Talon's right, broke the silence with a sharp snort. His arms were crossed and he leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the room. "Look at the Vikid ships. Pathetic," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Species like them don't belong on the battlefield. They should have stayed on their homeworld." Lyle, the tallest and slimmest of them, shifted slightly in his seat. His long fingers tapped the table as he studied the display. "True, but maybe they could have been useful if they came in greater numbers," he said thoughtfully. "They're not completely without merit, but in these numbers, they're just a waste." Talon saw an opening to join the conversation. His lips curled into a small smile. None of them had mentioned the humans yet, and he couldn't resist taking the chance to mock them, the humans, with their absurd designs and misguided sense of justice. "The Vikid might not be impressive," Talon said with a light tone, "but they're no worse than the humans." His voice took on a playful edge as he continued. "At least the Vikid managed to arrive on time. The humans, though, were late." He leaned forward, adding with mock seriousness, "Their ships are a joke. Railgun ships that can't even turn before they get hit, fast ships that fall apart if you so much as touch them, and missile carriers that don't even have warp cores. Truly, I could go on for hours." Laughter rippled through the room, the warlords shifting in amusement as Talon's mocking tone filled the space. He leaned back, pleased with the reaction, as the others chuckled. "I guess we'll just have to wait and see how these humans perform." Zane smirked, a playful glint in his eyes. "If they manage to survive long enough to even make it to the battlefield." He teased. Talon's central eye narrowed in amusement. This was precisely why he preferred his own species. No endless debates or ridiculous moral posturing, just the shared enjoyment of mocking the absurdity of their less capable allies. But even among his own people, there were always those who soured the mood. Vorn was one of them. His skin, a deeper shade of pink than most, and his constant ear twitches made him seem perpetually irritated. He had a knack for ruining conversations with unnecessary complaints and complications, and today was no different. "The Real's fleet seems to be doing better than ours," Vorn muttered, his three eyes locked on the holographic display. His words lingered in the air, unpleasant like a bad smell, causing Talon's ears to twitch in mild annoyance. Talon leaned forward, scrutinizing the holographic map with a more discerning eye. The Real fleet did indeed appear slightly larger, and their formation was impressive. Their ships were arranged in a tight concentric pattern, with the heaviest vessels on the outer ring and the more maneuverable ones in the center. He exchanged a glance with Zane and Jackson, noting that they too shared his view. Vorn's observation, though not entirely off base, felt unnecessary and out of place in a room that thrived on humor. "They might have slightly greater numbers," Talon said, his voice steady, "but I'm not convinced about the quality of their ships." Zane, who had been reclining with his arms crossed, suddenly stood with an unnatural grace. His thin frame towered over the table like a monolith, his pale pink skin shimmering in the low light as he spoke. "They're organized, I'll give them that," Zane said, his three eyes narrowing in scrutiny. "But once the battle begins, their primitive tendencies will take over. They'll lose their formation and act on emotion. It's inevitable." Kral, never one to pass up an opportunity for humor, leaned forward, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Maybe they're just trying to compensate for their smell," he joked, causing a ripple of laughter to spread through the room. Talon felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him as the warlords burst into laughter. Even Zane's serious analysis seemed to lose its weight under the humor. Vorn, trying to speak up again, found his voice drowned out by the collective amusement. He tried again to point out flaws in the Grimm's formation, but no one was paying attention. The room was lighter now, the joke having successfully silenced Vorn's unwelcome observations. It was a small victory for Talon, where sharp humor and jabs held sway over superiority. The mood aboard the command ship shifted as the battle drew nearer. The warlords focused on their final preparations, some delivering speeches to their crews, offering words of encouragement to those about to risk their lives for the future of their species. Others barked orders at captains in the commons, demanding last-minute adjustments to their formations. Frustration simmered in the air, thick with the anticipation of the chaos to come. Talon, however, did none of that. He stood by the holographic display, his long limbs folded in thought, staring at the empty space where the human ship should have been. Their ridiculous designs were supposed to arrive at any moment. Though Talon had no real expectations of their usefulness, he found himself curiously waiting. He watched the display, counting down the moments until the battle officially began. The holographic map, marked friend and foe, erupted into motion as both sides advanced. Thousands of ships, some sleek and gleaming, others bulky and ominous, surged forward like streams of light, converging toward the center. The space between the fleets became a storm of energy, missiles, and plasma beams as their formations collided. The void was lit up with streaks of light, twisting ships, and violent explosions. Talon's eyes darted across the battlefield display, taking in the chaos. Ships from both sides repositioned according to their strengths. Smaller, weaker species were caught in loose skirmishes, facing off against similar opponents, their formations wavering like leaves in the wind. Meanwhile, the larger fleets, the KAC and the Cole, were preparing for a decisive confrontation with the enemy's strongest forces. Despite the madness unfolding before him, Talon couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for the way an odd sense of order was emerging. Different species, each with their own methods of warfare, naturally gravitated toward battles that suited their capabilities. It was a glimpse into the universal nature of combat. Despite the vast differences in biology and technology, there was an underlying predictability in how each species chose to fight. But then something troubling caught Talon's attention. The weaker species on their side were being wiped out far faster than their counterparts on the opposing side. A grim pattern emerged as Allied ships vanished from the display, one by one, their formations crumbling under the enemy's pressure. If this continued, the larger fleets, the Krak and the Ral, would be forced to compensate for the losses, risking their own ships just to hold the line. Kral's gruff voice broke the tension. "Where are the humans?" he asked, turning momentarily away from his conversation with the captain. "We could use some cannon fodder right about now." Zane, standing beside Talon, shot a sharp glance at him. "Talon," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "You're the one who recruited them. Surely you know something." Talon felt a flicker of irritation beneath his calm demeanor. The humans weren't just late, they were missing. "I've heard nothing from them," he replied, his voice cool. "Knowing the real, I wouldn't be surprised if they bullied the humans into not showing up." Unease rippled through the room. What had started as a joke about the humans was now a real problem. They needed cannon fodder, something to slow the enemy's advance. Even the smallest distraction would help. Gone were the jokes. The room grew heavier with each passing second. The reality set in. They were losing. The weaker fleets on their side had been outlasted, and now their strongest ships would have to risk everything to save the battle. But the numbers weren't in their favor. It became increasingly clear. If they didn't act soon, the outcome wouldn't be a glorious defeat, but a slow, inevitable decline for their entire species. Most of the warlords leaned forward, their eyes glued to the display as their fleets were outmaneuvered. Talon finally broke the silence. Talon's tone was steady, but the weight of his words felt like a burden. "Perhaps it's time we retreat," he suggested calmly. "Let the Grim take the brunt of the losses. They're better equipped for it." The room went silent, a heavy pause hanging in the air. No one opposed him, but the tension was palpable as the gravity of the situation settled in. Talon's eyes never wavered, watching the internal conflict unfolding in the other warlords. Finally, it was Jackson, the warlord who had first mocked their human allies, who made the call. His voice wavered ever so slightly as he issued the retreat order over the comms. One by one, the other warlords followed suit. The silence that followed signaled their unanimous agreement. The jokes were gone, replaced by grim resolve. The warlords fixed their gaze on the display as their fleet pulled back, leaving the Ral to hold the line. Desperate messages flooded the comms, the Ral's growls of frustration and anger filling the airwaves. But the Kovac fleet remained unperturbed, following their unspoken understanding that survival was paramount over honor today. Zane broke the silence, attempting to lighten the mood with a dry remark. "At least we won't be the ones explaining why half the fleet was lost," he said with a sardonic smile. His attempt at humor, however, fell flat and the weight in the room remained unrelieved. Sensing an opportunity to diffuse the tension, Talon leaned back slightly, offering a smirk. "Well, if anyone complains, we can always tell them we arrived on time and at least took part in the battle, unlike the humans," he teased. His words landed perfectly, and a ripple of laughter spread through the room, momentarily breaking the looming sense of dread. But the brief moment of levity evaporated as quickly as it had come. Without warning, the holographic display blinked, and a new signal materialized on the battlefield. A single dot, huge, imposing, and unlike anything they had seen before, appeared. It was the size of a small moon, far larger than any ship in the vicinity, dwarfing both friend and foe alike by a factor of 100. The room went quiet, the stunned silence palpable, as Talon's three eyes locked onto the display. His posture stiffened as he realized the implications of what had just occurred. Whatever that enormous object was at the center of the battle, it was a game changer. Talon didn't need to order a scan. The process had already begun. The results came back without identifying the object. It didn't match any known ship design from their database. This was something new, something entirely unexpected. That quickly changed when several bays and hatches on the colossal vessel opened, and from within, a swarm of smaller ships, tens of thousands, poured out. The scanners immediately recognized them, flagging them with a familiar, almost mocking result. Talon's eyes widened in realization as the unmistakable shapes of human ships flooded the battlefield. He couldn't help but voice his disbelief, his words laced with self-mockery. "Well, there goes our excuse for defending the retreat. Why would the cannon Fodder show up now?" No one answered. His words fell on deaf ears as the warlords were too mesmerized to even glance in his direction. Their attention remained fixed on the display, as though they were watching the impossible unfold. Talon, sensing the situation was no time for jokes, focused his full attention on the display. What he saw next made him forget his usual disdain for human ships. The first wave of enemy vessels, eager to test their firepower against the massive human ship, launched a full-scale assault. Talon braced himself for the inevitable. He was certain the oversized target would be obliterated in a matter of moments. He pictured a massive explosion, the human's hubris punished with swift destruction. But the explosion never came. Instead, a formation of bulky, unarmed human ships surged forward, positioning themselves strategically between the incoming missile and laser fire and the massive human vessel. Talon's jaw dropped as the defensive ships absorbed the onslaught, their specialized designs allowing them to withstand the barrage with minimal damage. The enemy's attacks, which should have destroyed any ordinary ship, barely left a mark on these flying fortresses. Their armor, designed purely for defense, held firm. Before Talon could fully process what was happening, the next stage of the human formation came into view. The railgun ships, the ones they had ridiculed as clumsy and overly specialized, moved into position. But here, with the protection of the bulkier ships, their slow movements became an advantage. They had all the time they needed. Talon's three eyes narrowed as he observed the railguns lining up, the long barrels adjusting as they prepared to fire. Then, the first barrage was launched. The projectiles took time to reach their targets, long enough for Talon to think the maneuver had been ineffective. But when they hit, the impact was devastating. The sheer volume of projectiles was overwhelming, inundating the battlefield with a wave of unstoppable force. The enemy ships, which had initially charged forward with confidence, were caught off guard and unable to react in time. Every single attacking vessel was obliterated, their wreckage scattering into space. Talon stood frozen, his jaw slack as he stared at the display. The humans, the very species they had mocked, had just turned the tide of the battle in a single moment. The warlords around him remained silent, their expressions reflecting the same disbelief. Jackson, finally breaking the silence, spoke with a sense of resignation. "It won't matter," he said. "We've already retreated. Our fleet isn't even in position anymore." Talon nodded, his thoughts matching Jackson's. The human display had indeed shifted the course of the battle, but their fleet had already withdrawn, leaving a critical gap in the front line. As murmurs of failure rippled through the room, Talon's focus was drawn back to the massive human vessel. Another wave of ships poured out of its bays, this time the fast, fragile ships they had mocked earlier. The speed of these ships was astonishing. In a matter of moments, they zipped through the protective formations, dodging enemy fire with ease. Their attacks weren't powerful enough to destroy the enemy outright like the railguns, but that wasn't their goal. Every time the enemy attempted to target them, they simply evaded, retreating back into the protection of the larger ships when necessary. Talon's attention locked onto a Z6 Union vessel, one of the fastest enemy ships, which broke formation to pursue the agile human vessels. Laser fire sprayed wildly, missing as the smaller human ships twisted and dodged effortlessly. Missiles exploded harmlessly in empty space. Even the Viz's explosive drones failed to connect. The human ships executed impossibly sharp turns, leaving the pursuing sixth ship with nothing but shadows. Then, a bulky human fortress ship positioned itself directly in the path of the sixth vessel. In a final attempt to avoid the collision, the C6 thrusters proved too slow, and the human ship effortlessly crushed it, proving that even unarmed, the humans could secure kills through clever tactics. What truly captured the attention of the other warlords, however, was the human strategy. The enemy, frustrated by the fast ship's constant harassment, would inevitably break formation to chase them down. But pursuing the fast ships meant getting closer to the humans' railgun formation, which wasted no time in launching another devastating attack. The humans unleashed a devastating barrage the moment the enemy drew near, setting a simple yet deadly trap. If the enemy did nothing, they would be slowly chipped away by the fast ships. But if they reacted and pursued, they would be destroyed by the railguns. It was a flawless strategy. As the other warlords came to realize what was unfolding, an uneasy silence settled over the room. No one spoke, as none could deny the brilliance of the humans' coordination. They couldn't find any reason to mock their strategy anymore, at least not when seen as a unified force. The ships, once ridiculed, had transformed from a joke into a serious threat. Talon, still staring at the holographic display, asked the question on everyone's mind. Should we re-enter the battlefield? No one responded. The silence wasn't out of hesitation, but because something else had caught their attention. From the colossal human ship, a new type of vessel emerged: missile carriers. They moved with painful slowness, lacking the warp cores or speed of their faster counterparts, but they advanced steadily, taking full advantage of the chaos caused by the fast ships and the overwhelming power of the railguns. Their acceleration remained constant as they drew closer to the enemy, positioning themselves for the strike. The warlords exchanged wary glances, all too aware of what was about to happen. Somehow, the humans had used their seemingly useless ships to craft a strategy that was unraveling the enemy before their eyes. The missile carriers, slow in their approach, finally reached their launch positions. Then, in perfect synchronization, they launched their entire arsenal. Hundreds, if not thousands of missiles surged forward in unison, a swarm of explosive death aimed straight at the heart of the enemy's remaining forces. The sight was overwhelming, with each missile leaving a trail of light in its wake. The carriers didn't wait to see if their missiles hit. They immediately executed a retreat, their now lighter frames accelerating rapidly toward safety. Talon and the other warlords watched in stunned silence as the missiles found their targets. The enemy ships, already weakened from the earlier engagements, had no defense left. Explosions rippled through the battlefield, taking out one vessel after another. Entire sections of the opposing fleet were torn apart in the blink of an eye, leaving only wreckage drifting through space. The destruction was total. The battle wasn't over, but victory was no longer in doubt. The warlords' reactions were muted. They sat stiffly, having just witnessed something they never expected. As the missile carriers retreated, Talon noticed something that made his three eyes widen in realization. The carriers weren't heading back to the colossal human ship. Instead, they were restocking from smaller supply ships, preparing for another round. Kronal and Zane began to argue, their voices tense. "We should join the battle now," Kronal barked. "We can't let the humans take all the glory after our retreat." Zane, towering and calm, shook his head. "The battle's almost over," he replied. "Joining now would be more humiliating than staying out." Talon listened to their bickering, his attention still on the display. He could see the human fast ships, the flimsy vessels they had mocked earlier, darting after the remnants of the enemy fleet. The humans were already pursuing the fleeing ships, cutting off their escape routes and ensuring there would be no retreat. As Talon watched, he realized something important. The argument between Kronal and Zane was pointless. "The battle's over," Talon said, his voice cutting through the room's tension. The others fell silent, following his gaze to the display. There was no denying it. The humans had won decisively, and without their help. As the realization sank in, the warlords were left with a sense of shame. They had retreated, believing the battle was lost. Yet the humans, those who had been late, those with the ridiculous ships, not only held the line but had obliterated the enemy. Now, all they could do was watch HFY sat alone in the same meeting room, the weight of past conversations pressing on him. He couldn't help but think back to the time he had sat here with the grim commander, listening to the brutish voice shake the walls as he mocked the humans. The room had felt cramped then, overwhelmed by the Grim's massive presence. But now, as HFY awaited the arrival of the human general and the same grim commander, the room felt even smaller. But for a very different reason. The looming embarrassment of his species' retreat filled the space like an invisible force. His spindly frame, once a source of quiet pride, felt brittle, hollow, as if the shame had seeped into his very bones. His three eyes stared blankly at the bioluminescent patterns on the wall, once soothing, now a reminder of the order and precision the humans had shown. Something his people had failed to understand. He had been the one to mock the humans. He had dismissed them, convinced their participation would be nothing more than a brief diversion, cannon fodder to buy time. Now, after their overwhelming victory, whispers spread among his people. Whispers that HFY had misjudged, that his arrogance had led them to retreat when they should have held their ground. He knew the truth. He wasn't solely to blame. The retreat had been a collective decision, with all the warlords hesitant to risk their fleet in what had seemed like a doomed battle. But someone always had to take the fall. It was the way of war, the way of politics. His three eyes shifted uneasily. He had been the one to recruit the humans, the one who had vouched for their usefulness. If blame fell anywhere, it would likely be on his shoulders. Just as these unsettling thoughts deepened, the door hissed open. The grim commander lumbered into the room, his dark leathery hide gleaming under the dim lights. He was an imposing figure, massive, hunched slightly to fit through the doorway, his tusks jagged and cracked, protruding menacingly from his lower jaw. His small, beady eyes, once filled with fury, now carried a trace of hesitation. Beside him entered the human general, a sharp contrast. The human was smaller, more compact, but his posture was upright, and his expression calm, exuding a certain sharpness. His uniform was pristine, adorned with various insignia, possibly from victories. The human broke the silence first, his voice steady and clear. "General Griffin," he introduced himself, his tone formal but not without warmth. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." His gaze briefly shifted toward the towering grim commander, who remained silent, looming behind him like a shadow. HFY was taken aback by the lack of accusation, especially from the grim. He had expected a barrage of blame, a reminder of their failure. There was no attack on his decisions, but the grim commander stood in silence, his tusked mouth firmly shut. This was unlike him, especially after their last meeting when the grim had dominated the conversation, his aggressive stance making his opinions clear. After a brief moment of hesitation, HFY spoke, his three eyes flicking between the human and the grim. "I must admit, I didn't expect such a cordial reception under the circumstances." His gaze lingered on the grim a moment longer, trying to understand why the once fearsome commander was suddenly so subdued. General Griffin's expression remained composed as he answered, "Humanity doesn't blame you for retreating. In fact, we didn't plan on swooping in as the heroes at the last moment. There were complications." His voice was steady, with no trace of mockery, as if he were simply stating facts. HFY furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "Complications?" he asked skeptically. "Your strategy seemed flawless. I can't imagine what trouble you could have had, especially after witnessing your fleet's coordination." The human general chuckled softly, the first break in his stern demeanor. "Perfect, maybe, but our usual tactic involves exiting warp with our mothership's main cannon already primed and ready. Then we hurl a lump of antimatter at relativistic speeds into the enemy fleet to start the fight." HFY blinked, struggling to process the sheer audacity of such a tactic. The human paused, his tone lighter now, almost amused as he added, "The only reason we didn't do that this time was because we were afraid it would destroy everything, friend and foe alike." There was a brief, stunned silence. HFY's three eyes shifted toward the grim commander. For the first time, he fully understood why the hulking figure had been so unusually quiet. Perhaps keeping silent and avoiding any remark that might provoke the human's wrath was the wiser choice after all.